Hey, what's up you guys? I'm Sara Lubratt and today's video is part 1 of 5 where we are going to be breaking down the steps to write a book. Every year for I believe the last 4 years, I make a video called how to write a book in blank, like whatever year it is. This year we're going to be talking about how to write a book from start to finish. And instead of just making one video with a couple tips in it to help you guys write a book, I decided to break it down even further into a 5-episode series where a new episode comes out every Monday in January to help walk you guys through every step in the writing process. In today's video, we're going to be talking all about brainstorming, planning, plotting, outlining, setting, character, scheduling, all good things to know before you actually get to the blank page. We'll be talking about writing craft as well as practical tips for writing a book this year. So now without further ado, we're going to get into the video. Make sure you hit like and subscribe and turn on the bell notification so that you don't miss any of the other 4 episodes. And now let's start talking about how to prepare to write a book. It seems like writers fall on a spectrum of how much information they need to know before they begin writing, and that kind of ranges from the plotters to the pantsers, or the people that fly by the seat of their pants. I am definitely more on the pantser side than I am on the plotter side, so I'm going to be approaching this a little bit from that pantser mentality of more of the bare minimum of what you need to know about your story before you begin writing. I personally don't need to know that much about my characters. I don't really need to know what they look like before I begin writing, but I do need to know a couple of things. The most important thing you should know about your character is your character's motivation. What are they trying to accomplish? Why are they trying to accomplish that? Or why do they feel the way that they do? And character motivation is the first step in the character arc, which goes from motivation to goal to belief to lesson. So character motivation is like the most important thing that you can come up with before you begin writing. Again, this is the bare minimum. There are lots of character design sheets or character development sheets that you can find online with pretty much exhaustive information that you could fill out before you begin writing. But I personally don't believe that that's necessary. I think it's better to slightly underplan than overplan, but we will talk about that in a second. Once you have your character's motivation, the next step that we can move on to is figuring out the main conflict in the story. Conflict very basically breaks down into 2 categories, and that's either internal conflict or external conflict. So either the character is dealing something within themselves or they are dealing with something in their outside world. It's often interesting to have both, and conflict is made when the character motivation fights against where you're trying to get them at the end of the story. I was a creative writing major in college, and one of my assignments in one of my creative writing classes was to walk down the street, choose a random person, and come up with a backstory for that person, including a secret. And the secret is what really stuck out to me. What is this person trying to hide that might influence their character motivation throughout the story? The secret can really add to your character's internal conflict, which I think can make things really interesting. Once you have your character motivation, we can start thinking about the concept of plotting or outlining. Like I said, I'm much more of a pantser, so we are going to do the bare minimum of this. In my opinion, you can do more or less than this. If I'm having a lot of ideas for my story and I kind of know roughly what has to happen when to get to my ending, which is another thing, I tend to know roughly where my story starts, but I definitely know where my story ends. And basically, I then just have to figure out how I get from point A to point B, or point Z, really, with a lot of letters in between. But figuring out the middle of the story is where I typically need the most help. I have tried one outlining method that I really enjoyed, and that's called the story gridding method. I couldn't find my story grid when I was looking for it before I sat down to film this video, but basically I made a giant grid, and then in the first column I would write the chapter number, or roughly where in the story it needed to happen. If you wanted to really break this down, you could do this in 3 parts, 5 parts, but basically just chunking it out a little bit and then writing down roughly what has to happen in order to get your characters from the beginning of the story to the ending of the story. This really worked for me when I was reverse outlining my story, and probably would have worked a lot better if I had used it earlier on in my writing process, but this is super easy to do by hand or in a spreadsheet where it's really easy to move things around as you continue to flesh out your story's plot. The story gridding method worked a lot better for me as opposed to just a bullet point list, because I used it for a book that I was writing with multiple POVs, so I needed to keep track of where my different characters were in every grouping of 3 to 5 chapters, just so that I knew when characters crossed paths or when something in one character's perspective was going to affect something in the next character's chapter. It basically just helped me keep everything straight, which is really, really great. Another really helpful resource is Save the Cat Writes a Novel, where on page 22, they include the beat sheet for a 3-act structure. So it breaks down basically what should be happening in each percentage of the book. The setup should be first percent to 10%, the catalyst should happen around 10% of the way into the book, the fun and games should happen between 20 and 50%, etc., and so forth. So if you need help structuring a book, especially if this is your first book, I highly recommend the beat sheets in Save the Cat. Something else that I find really helpful when plotting or brainstorming or trying to come up with my idea for a story is something that I learned from taking Brandon Sanderson's online lecture series. They are free and available on YouTube. Highly recommend watching them. And it's what all of the notes that you can't see behind my head are about. But written on those sheets is something that Brandon Sanderson talks about in his lectures, and that's how to progress the story. He calls it the 3 Ps: promise, progress, and payoff, which is just another way to look at how to progress your story and move the plot along to the end. Something else that will aid in the development of your plot are emotional touch points, because the story can't be really high stakes all the time, because then it will just lose its impact. It needs to have moments where it builds, it needs to have moments where it falls, it needs to have moments that are kind of neutral and stagnant, maybe not stagnant as much as it is just stable. Emotional touch points are great to include between characters, either building friendships, relationships, family relationships, and how those relationships affect the main character and their motivation and what they're trying to accomplish by the end of the story. Something else you might want to keep in mind with your characters and your plot that Brandon Sanderson also talks about in his lecture series are likability scales. And I didn't write that down, so I will need to refer to my list. Not that you guys can see it, but it's right here on my notes. That throughout the story, in order to provide yourself or your readership a rooting interest for your main character, you can have sliding scales for likability, proactivity, and competence. So in the beginning, your character might not be very likable as the reader is getting to know them, and maybe they're proactive but not very competent, and then throughout the story, the competence and the likability rise. Some other things that I wrote down on here that I forgot to make note about for this video, in the promise, progress, payoff, is to note how your characters are going to change throughout that. Flaws, limitations, and handicaps go hand in hand with the likability scales of likability, proactivity, and competence, that you need to hit characters hard in their flaws if you want them to change throughout the story. And then as far as setting goes, I have notes on here that say treat setting like a character so that your setting also develops as your story goes along, and that you should convey setting information through the eyes of the characters in a way that exemplifies who the character is to help better personify and describe your characters, which I understand is a lot of information. You do not need to figure out all of that before you begin writing your book. Some of this will become apparent to you while you're writing. Some of this is stuff that you can change when you're editing, but you do not need to know or think about all of that before you begin your story. It is my personal opinion that it is a little bit better to underplot than overplot, and I've heard that from my friends that are plotters, that once they plot or outline too extensively, they have no desire to actually write the story because there's no exploration, there's no inventing things as you go. You kind of lock yourself in a box, and then there's no freedom to play once you begin writing. So at the bare minimum, character motivation, some kind of setting. Knowing your setting can be super helpful with writing a book, especially if your characters will be moving about at all. This could be like walking down the street to a coffee shop, or this could be traveling across a continent. I recommend making a map. You don't have to do this before you begin writing, but once you start writing, this might be something that's helpful for you. In my high fantasy project that I call Project DE, I finished book 1 over the summer, and I've started brainstorming for book 2. Something that really helped me with that story was map making. I have 4 different versions of the same map. I have one with notes, I have one with place names, I guess I have my basic map, and I have a map that's color-coded to the travel patterns of each of my 3 main characters in book 1. This can just help you visualize where your characters are, how long it might take them to get there, things like that. The third thing that I think is super important to have is some concept of your plot or where you want your character or characters to get to at the end of the story. And the fourth and last thing is to have some concept of tone. The tone that you choose for your story might be different than what the subject matter might seem like would make sense. Like if your story is all about death or terminal illness, you might want to include some more humor in it so that it's not just dark and grim the whole time. They still want moments of humor, of lightness, or something to vary those emotional touch points throughout the story, even if the topic is very grim. You'll also need to figure out how you want to start writing the book, whether that's in present or or past tense, and the point of view that you're writing your story from, whether that's first, second, or third. First and third are definitely the most common, and there's no reason that you can't start the story one way and then figure out that something works better later, but you need to have an idea of where you want to try starting. This is also a friendly reminder or friendly information if this is the first time you've ever tried writing a book, that books are written in drafts. I have a quote here on my writing motivation board, and it's a quote by Shannon Hale that says, "I'm writing a first draft and reminding myself that I'm simply shoveling sand into a box so that later I can build castles." Your rough draft is not going to look like the vision that you have in your head, but that's what editing is for. We are going to talk about editing later on in this series. The whole point of a first draft or a rough draft or a zero draft or whatever you choose to call it is to get your idea down on paper. That might seem like a lot of information. I hope you guys are holding with me because now we're going to move into talking about brainstorming. Again, I personally do not plot very much. I don't outline at all typically, but what I definitely do is brainstorm. And in my brainstorming, I work through some of those things that we talked about in the first part of this video. Something that I will recommend to every single person trying to write a book is to have a brain dump document or notebook or note on your phone or somewhere where you put every single idea that you have for either this one specific story or for every story that you are possibly playing around with. It's important to write down all of your ideas because you will forget them, and it's important to try and keep those notes in one spot. Something I freaking adore and highly recommend is Aqua Notes. These will be linked down in the description box below. I've used these for years. I've given these as gifts, but it's basically a waterproof notepad with like suction cups that you hang up in your shower. It also comes with a pencil with a suction cup, and this is in no way sponsored. I just freaking love these, so that even when you're coming up with ideas in the shower, you can write them down so that you don't forget your ideas when you're in the shower. And I think their tagline is something like "no more ideas down the drain," which is brilliant. But Aqua Notes for brainstorming, especially when you are in such an intensive brainstorming phase, or at any point in writing a book when you come up with something in the shower and you don't want to have to like dry your hands off to like try and write something on your phone, Aqua Notes is a great tool to have in your shower. So brainstorming, a little bit less daunting than the plotting, planning, outlining, characters, setting, and everything else that we talked about in the beginning of this video. I strongly recommend having a brain dump document or an ideas document where you put every single idea that you have for your story. This could be every single plot point that you could possibly come up with, every line, quote, vibe, article of clothing, a phrase, a potential title, any possible idea you have should go in this one document. My brain dump documents are called brain dump documents because they're pretty messy. There's very little organization to them other than that's just where all my ideas go. You could do bullet points, you could try to organize it if you want to, but I think that there's a little bit of beauty in the mess. You could also brainstorm on paper. Like I said, I am much more on the pantser side of the spectrum, so brainstorming is my go-to. I still figure out my character motivation. I still figure out where I want my characters to be at the end of the story, and then I just do a lot of brainstorming. Two other amazing brainstorming tools is creating a playlist, either full of music for your story or a couple of songs or even one song, especially to start out with. We all start with one song, and then you can build out your playlist from there, but full of, again, the vibe of the story, any songs that spark ideas for your story, any songs that you might want to write with the song playing in the background. And then the same goes for a Pinterest board. A Pinterest storyboard is one of the most magical things. It's also so much fun to just scroll Pinterest for hours and just pin anything that could possibly be an idea, spark an idea, be a vista I want to include in a book, be an outfit that I think one of my characters would wear, etc. and so forth. Building a Pinterest board helps you visualize your story, just like building a playlist can help you picture the story in your head. As I'm working on brainstorming my new book, something that has been working for me really, really well in the last few days is getting on a treadmill or going for a walk outside if you want to, but for me it's winter, and looping one song in my headphones as I just like stare at my phone and jot down notes. I have writing playlists for each of my stories, but each of those writing playlists, I could pick out like one or two songs that are the most indicative of my story and my plot, and those tend to be the ones that I listen to on repeat as I'm brainstorming. And then I also feel so productive when I'm done with my walk because I was just using that time and movement to brainstorm. Another point on plotting or outlining is to try and keep your plotting a little bit looser than you feel like you might need to give your story the chance to evolve and change as you write. I can guarantee you you that your book is not going to come out exactly like your outline. But one of the biggest things I've noticed for people that outline very, very extensively is that they stop writing when they get frustrated that their story is not exactly following their outline. So make sure that you build in some space to allow yourself to be creative and for things to change, because they will. One of the questions I get a lot about writing a book is what software I use. I use Microsoft Word. You can use anything to write a book. You can write a book by hand. You could write a book on Post-it notes if you wanted to. The software doesn't matter. You can write by hand, you can write by using Microsoft Word, you can use Google Docs, you can use Scrivener. I recommend using whatever you are most comfortable with, because it isn't about the software, it's about getting your story ideas down. So whatever you are comfortable with writing in is what you should use. And the last thing I want to talk about is setting goals with your writing. The reason that I talk about scheduling writing time and protecting that writing time is so that you actually accomplish your goal. Finding a time to write, or setting a time to write, or scheduling a time to write, and then showing up for yourself and/or writing in that is how you build self-confidence. And just like any other habit, the more you do that, the more you will continue to show up for yourself, and the more you will continue to build that self-confidence. So if you want to write a book that is 100,000 words long, which is pretty common for like a fantasy debut, a YA debut tends to be like 80,000 words, but just for the easiness of numbers, we're going to go with a book that's 100,000 words long. But if your goal for this year is to write a book, writing 274 words a day will get you a book by the end of the year. I believe it's a Stephen King quote that says a page a day is a book in a year, and 270-ish words will get you to that page. And how to schedule that is most people tend to write 300 to 700 words an hour. So you could schedule that by thinking that that could be 30 or 45 minutes a day. If you want to write a book in 6 months, or if you are wanting to write 3 to 4 days a week instead of all 7, which most of us do not write 7 days a week, you could write an average of 548 words every day for 6 months, or every other day for a year, and still end up with that 100,000 word book by the end of the year, or by the end of the 6-month period. If you can only find the time to write 2 days a week, you might want to shoot for 960-ish words, and those 960 words 2 days a week for a year will still get you to that 100,000 word goal. And it's all about how you break down your goal and how you choose to show up for that goal that will help you write this book. So start scheduling your writing time, start protecting that writing time. Remember that consistency is key and progress is progress. That brings us to the end of episode 1 of this 5-part series. Make sure you come back next week for episode 2, where we're going to talk about how to actually start writing and getting your idea down on paper. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I'm Sara Lubratt. Make sure you like and subscribe if you have not already, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.